Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We are discussing Halloween in the Ozarks. Why do we dress up at Halloween, go to spook houses, trick or treat, and everything else we do in October? How spooky is the season in the Ozarks?
There is a lot behind the costumes and trick-or-treating that only makes sense if you know the stories behind them. It's a lot more than just going through the motions to get candies. If you throw in scary movies and why they are popular at Halloween, there are a lot of old and new traditions and rabbit holes to go down, figuring them all out.
We will get back to Halloween, but first we want to invite you to like, follow, and subscribe to Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, as well as your favorite podcast platform. We also invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook. On the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, click subscribe, have your login information ready, and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for only $4.99 per month.
Your $4.99 per month subscription allows you to come with us on paranormal investigations, deep dive research, and topics too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers will be entered in a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first-run copy of the book Dark Ozarks, The Spooklight. Subscribe today to be entered in the drawing. And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
Thank you to Stay the Ozarks online magazine, dedicated to preserving and celebrating Ozarks culture since 2007. Free access to hundreds of articles. Find more information about Stay of the Ozarks events, and be sure to sign up for the Stay of the Ozarks Weekly, delivered free to your inbox every Sunday night, featuring new writings and a down-home Ozark recipe in every issue at www.staytheozarks.net.
Mark your calendars for upcoming live events beginning Saturday, September 30th at the Civil War Home, Kendrick House in Carthage, Missouri, and a number of other locations through November. Meet Dark Ozarks producers, Lisa and Josh, for evenings of history, legends, and the paranormal, and even visit some of the most haunted locations in the Ozarks. Details on the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, and visit www.paranormalsciencelab.com for tickets and more information.
We encourage you to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online, on Facebook and at the website alwaysbuyingbooks.com for all of your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention the building's haunted. Tell Bob and Elise that we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and great food in a historical building with a noir past. And yes, their building is also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
Halloween, it's something that most people think they have a handle on. They know all about it. It's all about, school trick-or-treat parties and, haunted houses and scary movies.
And those things are important. They're a very important part of the pop culture aspects of a modern Halloween, which is a cultural juggernaut in and of itself. Yes. And at the same time, it is much less known of the very ancient origins of Halloween. We are talking about essentially a solar fire festival that is directly Celtic in nature, dating back well over 2,000 years, realistically dating back over 3,000 years, and celebrated on the same date.
Well, yes, and another thing that people might not realize, it's really a New Year's celebration because November 1st was the new year in the Celtic calendar.
It was Samhain, and of particular note, we do associate and appropriately associate Halloween with night, and the traditional major festival dates, the festival holidays, is it just even that in terms of how our modern language does not necessarily do this justice is even found in the word holiday, which of course is a portmanteau of holy day. The original Celtic festival date of Samhain was not a day, it was a night.
Right.
The,
And go ahead.
The primary calendared festivals on the wheel of the season, or for the Celts, were all from dusk until dawn, and it is a testament. Of course, this carries over heavily into what we're talking about with Halloween, but the other dramatic festival seasons or festival times in the Celtic calendar, including but not limited to Imbolc and essentially May Day, or what we would think of as Walpurgis Night or Walpurgis Nacht now, as well as the Nasa, are not not days. They are from the setting of the sun over midnight, with midnight being very important element in this process, to dawn of the next day. So the festival is in and of itself a liminal space, transitioning from one day to the other.
And and maybe this is just informed of that I really am Celtic, because that's my daily schedule, it seems.
That is fair, and there's something, I suppose, for the uninitiated to the Dark Ozarks podcast. We're going to be talking a lot about liminal space, and for people who are unfamiliar with that term, it could also be classified as threshold space, a space that is neither one nor the other. It is within the space between. And when you're dealing with lore, but also when you're dealing with more ancient cosmologies, particularly Celtic, but not limited to Celtic, belief structures, that in-between space is exceptionally important. And it is, if you were to imagine, it's also called threshold space, like a threshold between in a door between one room and the other. And so it is interesting, especially when you, and we'll get into this, but when you do comparisons of actual findings in terms of paranormal research, and then compare this with more ancient cosmological belief structures, there's an excellent crossover that our modern, let's put everything in a secular box, doesn't speak to in a way that this does. And so what we're talking about is, if there were, for example, two worlds, a realm of the celestial realm of some sort that we can't really understand, and the physical realm that we live in, the idea is that there is a liminal space, a threshold, a gate, or a doorway space in between, and that all sorts of things go on within that space. And Halloween is really all about that space opening up and spilling out into our world.
Yes. And a sense of duality that is hard for modern Western minds to grasp in a lot of ways, that really was at the heart of the beginning of these ideas that eventually led to what we know as Halloween.
It does. And with that, you had the situation, and I think that many of the folk practices that became commercialized really speak on a deep level into our psyche, that say things about these liminal spaces. And I think that culturally, Halloween is very powerful and very important, because it does begin to contextualize things that people experience, especially in the paranormal, that they don't have words for.
I agree with that. I agree with that. I think this might be a good spot to read a poem.
I happen to have one. A poem simply entitled Halloween by Molly Capes, first published in this particular compendium of All the Silver Pennies in 1925. And it says, bolt and bar the front door, draw the curtains tight. Wise folk are in before moonrise tonight. Halloween, Halloween, chestnuts to roast, a gift for the fairy, a prayer for the ghost. Who will have their fate told? This night is known. Whose hand is full of gold? Who goes alone? Halloween, Halloween, snapdragon blue, a lover for me and a fortune for you. Stars shiver blue and green, moons wide and white. There, tattered clouds between, witches take flight. Halloween, Halloween, apples abob, elves at the keyhole, and imps on the hob. 12 calls the deep bell to the hollow night. 12 whispers steeple tops far out of sight. Halloween, Halloween, fires burn high. Who shall say certainly? Who can tell truthfully what solemn company passes through the sky?
And I do love that poem, and it's in part because it fits our notions of Halloween, but there's also elements in there that some people might be a little confused by.
And I certainly, as a child, I've been very familiar and loved this poem from a very young age. But certainly, I can say, as a 6, 7-year-old, being presented with this, loving it, but also questioning, because there were elements within this piece that certainly do not speak to a commercialized or modern, in my case, 1980s Halloween, and especially the things like chestnuts to roast, a gift for the fairy, a prayer for the ghost,
and lovers and so forth. It's is this Christmas? Is this Valentine's or what? But traditionally, it's all Halloween.
It is, and it really speaks to this idea, very powerfully encapsulates. First of all, everything in the poem is folklorically correct.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's something that's very beautiful. Everything within this comparatively sparse poem speaks meaningfully to very crucial and critical element to the traditional Halloween lore. And it also really speaks to this combination of anticipation, of magic, and also dread. Beginning with bolt and bar the front door, draw the curtains tight. Wise folk are in before moonrise tonight. There is that warning that Halloween, in some cases, is very dangerous, and at the same time beautiful and magical and powerful.
Well, you rarely get magic and power, etc., without a little risk.
No, it really wouldn't be magic otherwise.
And it's hard to talk about the beginnings of these traditions without, going back to the Isles, because that's really where this started.
In so many ways. And of course, Halloween as we know it today is a culmination of many hybridized popular culture factors. But Halloween, as it was understood in the British Isles, and most especially Ireland as well, was a homogenized or a culminative process. Even the name, which is a derivation of All Hallows Eve, which it was the Vatican's attempt to take ownership over a Celtic concept. And and just to go off on a tangent with the Celts, I have a theory that at the end of all days, at the end of everything, after the great machinations of world globalism have monolithically ground to a halt, and there is no worlds left to conquer, at some point, everything will ultimately be converted to a spiny Celticism that somehow manages to rise up and take over, because we have seen that happen. The Celts have suffered in the face of Roman invasion, in the face of Norman conquest, in the face of the
Jacksons and
British imperialism, in the face of so many things, have been defeated over and over and over with tragic, mind-numbing, heart-wrenching losses, from Boudicca to Culloden, to the Irish wars, to the Irish famine, to the systematic, really systematic genocide, of attempted genocide of the Irish in the 1840s. And yet all of those horrible processes and those monolithic governmental structures and vast military powers have all been relegated to various aspects of dusty history. And yet the Celts are still here and still informing, not nations necessarily, but informing whole cultures.
Agreed. And I do think it has something to do with the ability to embrace duality and hold disparate ideas and even conclusions simultaneously.
It is an interesting edge, and I think it speaks to the power of the Celtic cosmology. Reminded a little of the national motto of the Isle of Man, which is a Celtic Viking island in the Irish Sea, that is demonstrated by a single emblematic piece of geometry with three pantalooned legs, one in each direction, and then in Manx, which I cannot speak, translates roughly to "whichever way you throw me, I will stand."
Yeah, and that pretty well sums up Celts as a people.
It does, and of course, minus all of the crazy pop culture stuff, which we'll be talking about next week.
Yes.
The origins of Halloween are objectively Celtic. There's no argument about that. There are elements of Romanization. There are elements of Scandinavian belief structures. There are certainly elements of Germanic belief structures and Anglo-Saxon belief structures that are included, but at its core, Halloween is the Celtic New Year, with great cosmological significance. And of course, it is the time in which ghosts and goblins and ghoulies and things that go bump in the night a lot.
Yes, because they have, heightened powers at that point to influence men.
I really love the idea that it is the from dusk until dawn, the moment in the year in which they're in charge.
Mm-hmm. And it certainly sometimes has that feel to the night on Halloween. And the natural, again, duality and dichotomy of the Celtic mind explains a lot of the development of some of the traditions, which basically was a way to buck that system, to push back at the supernatural powers that be controlling the night.
There, just in the continuation of the duality itself, there is at one side a sense of fear and trepidation over what is lurking in the night. The other side is not just an acceptance, but an embracing of the dark things of the night, and in some cases the taking of their personas on, and in a certain initial aspect. And I think that this is there is duality even within this. A lot of times our trick-or-treating, you dress up with a mask and you dress up with it, you become something else, which is State of the Ozarks resident cosplayer. I have a lot of experience in, but is in and of itself at least twofold in terms of its concept. Cursory reviews of Halloween traditions would explain the masks, the costumes and the masks, which, for the record, in the 19th century and early 20th century, many of these homemade costumes were truly horrifying.
Oh, definitely. They certainly surpass your sense of costume from the store. It's something really of a horror movie. You see these old photos.
It is genuinely horrifying. But with this is on a cursory view is the idea that you dress up as creatures of the night, so to speak, so that the real creatures of the night will mistake you for them and pass you by. And I think that that's certainly a very fair aspect. But another side of this is the idea of mortals taking on the guise of the underworld and then acting as their representatives. There is a taking on of the persona, which is in and of itself a vastly different psychological process, and certainly a vastly different spiritual process. To be the representative of the underworld, traveling from house to house, is a very different thing than just putting on a disguise so you don't get noticed.
Right, and that part of it is pretty much subconscious at this point. It's in the psyche for most people. I think for most people, they are just putting on a disguise. But it does also, it gives a freedom and a liberty that lent itself to development of things like trick or treat, which we generally, for the most part, the trick part has been left out in the last few decades. You know, you don't get too many tricks anymore, but then on the other hand, over time, homeowners and residents have been indoctrinated for the treat. So,
and even actively looking forward to that part. I'm in this particular case, in terms of our contemporary step into modernism and comparative luxury, I will say that I'm not going to complain about this. The good old days in which we were all supposed to be vastly more wholesome and nostalgic and just better human beings as a whole, you look at rural and urban traditions for Halloween, and for myself, I'm going, oh my gosh, this is terrifying.
Well, and there was a lot of actual destruction that went on. I mean, people climbing on roofs and tearing up houses and
breaking windows. The idea, that no, your house isn't possibly, your shrubbery isn't possibly getting toilet paper. No, we're breaking the windows out of your house.
yeah.
And that's a big difference.
Lucky.
And of course the idea, some urban areas of the idea of Devil's Night and almost riot level experiences and that sort of thing. And in rural settings, the idea of waking up and finding your outhouse has been moved to the top of your house. And it's up to you to try to figure out how to get it down, and those types of things. These are very, very different than, a handful of neighborhood kids showing up and getting Snickers bars on your front porch.
It's certainly a different catharsis.
Which might suggest that in many cases in the United States, we're actually comparatively more healthy and possibly less in need of violent catharsis, or we're just lazy.
Or just forgotten what the flip side is. We just watch it on movies now.
It's time to get back to the old. No, let's not get back to the old.
And we're not advocating that.
No, we are not. Nor are we advocating Wicker Man, although I do love the film. The original, not the extra crispy one with Nicolas Cage.
Yeah, I knew that would be coming tonight.
Instead, the extra crispy one with Christopher Lee.
Yes.
If you don't know what Wicker Man is all about, just remember, extra crispy.
Yes.
So, dumb suppers.
Yes. Or silent suppers. On All Ghost Night. I like that term. I do too. I really do too. I want to incorporate that somehow with something, but I just really like that.
And for individuals who might be wanting, the tradition of the dumb supper, again, originated in the British Isles, and it is in association with romantic divination.
Yes.
And it appears to be exclusively, if not almost exclusively, the purview of teenage girls wondering who their husbands are going to be.
Yes. Now, in some parts of England, young men would also partake, but only in certain areas did they, find that to be the case. So, it would change from region to region. But one thing that I really like about this is it kind of goes back to episodes we did recently on witchcraft, is that if you look at the dumb supper rituals, what screams to you is basically hoodoo. And so when people say that there are no traditions in Europe that would fall under the realm of hoodoo, it's not true. This is a practice that incorporates really the same things that hoodoo and parts and some aspects of voodoo do.
There's in essence what takes place, and there are regional variants. It is interesting to see how much in the 19th century dumb suppers were common in swaths of the United States, and the the areas in which they were most common do seem to be directly associated with areas that were heavily influenced by Anglo-Saxon and Scots-Irish immigration. And so you are dealing not exclusively, but you are certainly dealing with Appalachia. You are definitely dealing with the Ozarks and portions of Illinois, portions of southern Indiana, portions of Virginia, etc. So to set the cultural tone. But it is certainly in the United States, what we are looking at is a practice in which two or more teenage girls. We don't seem to have much of any indicator of a single girl doing this ritual alone. It's
not in the United States, no.
It's a group effort, and while there are variants in the practice with each recorded or documented situation, each region or sub-region seems to have its very specific rules of what the ritual is. It is a ritual.
Yeah, very much so.
Very important to understand that it is a ritual. And often an empty or abandoned house would be used. It would be done at a specific time, typically for dusk on, with a 10 o'clock or 11 p.m. hour being significant within the process as you're approaching midnight. And a meal or a ritualistic faux meal, one of the two, would be prepared without speaking. That's where the term dumb comes from, because no one spoke during the process, and everything was done backwards. The table would be set backwards. The meal preparation, if it was done, would be done backwards. Everything would be done in reverse.
Yes. Even, afterwards, taking a portion of the cake and walking upstairs backwards. And in some regions, even so specific that you couldn't look over your shoulder as you walked up the stairs. I would be in trouble. I'd never get through the ritual.
and no speaking, no laughing, no giggling. So this is certainly for a lot of teenage girls, this would have been a difficult ritual to manage in that regard.
And I think that is part of the point too, is that, if it didn't work, then you could always say this is why it didn't work.
So somebody messed it up, and then to conclude at the conclusion of the ritual, something was meant to happen that would indicate the future husband of at least one of the girls.
Yes, and sometimes it was more literal, and sometimes in some areas, particularly in some areas in England, the man would supposedly show up, which there would be times, obviously, that people were in on the joke, or family members were trying to sabotage this or anything, and so they would arrange for someone to show up. But it is more interesting that in America and a lot of Appalachia and through the Ozarks, that it became something that we would associate with Halloween maybe a little bit more, because a phantom or a doppelganger of the man would appear. Yes.
And there are various aspects. Now, there were other nights that in certain regions that a dumb supper was held. However, Halloween was a dominant one, and perhaps not surprisingly, all of the other dates are deeply significant to the Celtic calendar.
Yes. One thing that I do find very interesting is talking about the ingredients. Now, sometimes in some areas in America, there would be nothing actually prepared. It would be empty plates and just more of a a ritual going through the motions. Some would be more straightforward of something being baked. Sometimes it wasn't cooked, but ingredients mixed. But in some instances, and this is where it gets interesting as far as hoodoo, is that items would be incorporated, such as brick dust, sand, nail clippings, hair from the back of the head, etc. And these items would be mixed into the batter and then baked. And also a ritual of names and initials being used, which also is indicative of hoodoo and voodoo. But this definitely is not coming from West African traditions. This is coming from the Isles. So you have a parallel symmetry there with some of these traditions.
And it is hoodoo. There's no question about it in that regard, in terms of the actual folk practice. In Ozark Ghost Stories by Judy Docker Young and Richard Young, there's a fantastic dumb supper story. It was my introduction to the concept of the dumb supper, and now might be a good time to just share that.
Sure, go ahead. I think so.
It is a incredibly memorable story for me, and I highly recommend, if you can find the book. It's no longer in print, but the book, any of the folk tale books by Judy Docker Young are excellent and well worth whatever you might happen to pay for them as used books. But in this particular case, a girl and her friends commit themselves to the dumb supper. They're in the abandoned house. And also of note, before the 1950s, having abandoned houses that folks just randomly moved into or used at various times were not uncommon.
That's true. That's very true.
So for anyone thinking, oh, that's not realistic, that they just would find an abandoned house to use, wasn't that hard. In 1949, when my grandparents' house burned to the ground, the neighbors had them moved into a vacant house that was on the same dirt or gravel road that they had been living on by that night. And so it was a very different concept in terms of property and sort of those structural delineations. But the girls had gone to the abandoned house. They go to the abandoned house and they perform the dumb supper. And despite their desire to laugh or do things forward or any of these things, they do all of it correctly. And midnight is nearing, their timing is correct, and the dumb supper is complete, and they're sitting at the table, and they're all waiting apprehensively. And suddenly there's a huge flash of lightning. A gust of wind blows through the empty house and shakes the room and blows the few candles in the room out. And suddenly there is an apparition. There's a figure of a man seated at the one empty chair.
Mm-hmm.
The girls scream, and it's all done, and then it's over, and there's no apparition. They light the candles, trembling, and they're asking themselves, did they imagine it? Did they just get themselves so worked up? And then they look down at the spot, and there is a knife missing from the table setting. A couple of years go by, and then a stranger, dashing, handsome stranger, rides into town, and he catches the eye of one of the girls from the dumb supper. The the girl who led the dumb supper and performed the ritual, and they fall madly in love and are married. And the night of their wedding, and she's unpacking her dowry box, and of course she's been gifted the silverware set that they had used, minus the knife. And she begins unpacking this before her new husband, and suddenly she sees him that his face has gone white, and she asks him what's wrong, and of course she's not thinking of the dumb supper. That was years earlier.
Right.
And he's pale and he's trembling, and he moves up close to her, and out of his pocket he pulls the missing knife, and he says, "You were the witch who dragged me through hell that night." And he plunges the knife into her heart and disappeared.
And again, a little bit of witchcraft there. That is true. Yeah, a lot of these original silent supper, dumb supper traditions in the Isles was seen with a sense of borrowing, whether it's ingredients or the tools, and I really have to wonder that if it didn't, because there's references in materials that to wedding cake traditions coming from this, eating the piece of the cake at the wedding, after the wedding, and to save a piece for later. But the fact that in a lot of these original rituals, something was borrowed, or the idea that basically the entire ritual was borrowing and receiving information, may well be the antecedent to the saying, something new, something old, something borrowed, and something blue.
Yeah, I think that's quite possible. It really is. And coming back over, we'll be talking about this more as the season continues, but weddings and births were both considered threshold points that one approached with great trepidation.
Very true. It reminds me of a conversation actually in court this afternoon where another attorney was talking to the judge about something. Actually, they were talking about football, about a game coming up, and he said he wasn't going to make it because he had to stay home with one of the children because his wife and daughter were going to someone's wedding. And the bailiff pipes up and says, and he says, and so I feel kind of bad, I can't go. And he goes, "Oh, you'll just go to the next one." So our sense of trepidation has decreased overall, it seems.
It has. It really has. It is an odd, casually commercial world in which we find ourselves, and certainly is indicated by the concept that there is no fear associated with a Yuletide or a Christmas wedding, and in the old days that would have been horrifying.
Yeah, that certainly was not the time to get married in the old days.
No.
In a couple of interesting notes with this that kind of ties into that. I guess we should note that traditionally in the Ozarks, it was known as a demi-supper.
Yes.
And that would be dummy in the sense of either being mute or, a stuffed dummy, because they are silent.
Yes.
Not a denigration or slight to anyone, as what might be assumed from the word now. But an interesting note is that let's figure out where I put my note. And since Oklahoma, parts of Oklahoma are in the Ozarks, I think it's appropriate to mention that there is one place in North America that the dummy cake is actually referred to as a fate cake.
Yes.
And that's Oklahoma. And the irony is, I've heard this before because my mother grew up in Oklahoma, and I've heard my grandmother and her sisters talk about fate cakes. And so that was interesting to me, that it really is kind of one and the same. It's very similar, but it's one added thing. Not only do you divine the identity of the future husband, but the status and prosperity of the marriage as well through dreams.
There's a great deal of handed down cosmology associated with this, and of course also the regions themselves inform. I do appreciate the fact that in the Ozarks, the cake in question was typically made out of was cornbread.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that's what my grandmother and her sisters would describe as a fake cake, was cornbread as well.
And now I'm hungry for cornbread.
Oh. And interesting too is that only in the Ozarks in North America was the preparation of the food actually involving baking, as it did back in the old country.
That is especially anachronistic in the sense that, you know, there are arguments that an Elizabethan connection to the Ozarks is fabricated or over exaggerated.
Right.
But ever so often you do come across these tidbits that something happening in the Ozarks is very similar, if not identical, to something that happened in the British Isles 400, 500 years prior.
Exactly. And specifically in the Ozarks, the tradition would be that the several girls involved, that each girl would take a turn stirring the butter and shifting the cornbread as it bakes. And the rest of the ceremony is very much like the English counterpart, except for the storm that blows up. And in that sense, in the Ozark version, often a storm would blow up, and then there would be a divination dream as well.
Yes. And I, for one, do not envy the girls trying to cook in a wood-burning oven backwards.
Yeah.
I would struggle enough with just getting the knobs turned correctly, greasing the pan.
Yeah, doing it behind your back. However, there are parts of the Missouri Ozarks that the table set, but the eating of the meal is only simulated, because you actually set empty dishes. You can cook, but you set empty dishes. And that is how my grandmother and her sisters described it growing up in Oklahoma. At times they were in Oklahoma, sometimes in Texas, but mainly Oklahoma. And that's how they described it. And also, and the ingredients would be measured by a thimble, like it would be in England.
that is referenced in the documentation.
Mm-hmm.
And and of course, in some cases, if there was actually cake that was consumed, um, in many times that the girls would have to fast prior to the
Mm-hmm.
supper. But in the other cases in which there was no actual food being consumed, that was the fast in and of itself.
Yes.
And we
So in some sense, it seems to always have been a fast involved.
it is undeniably a divination ritual.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. Oh, and then sometimes, and this I have heard too, is that of putting, a wash bowl of water on the front porch and a towel, so that when the future husband showed up, that he could wash his hands.
Yes.
I've heard that before.
There's a lot of moving parts with this bit of magic. And
Yes.
as is appropriate with ritual, there's a lot of places you can screw it up too,
Mm-hmm.
which negates the entire thing.
And then you get into, well, phantoms, which I find very interesting, and certainly apropos for the season. But and specifically in the Ozarks, the fulfillment of the ritual is a phantom husbands enter in silence by one account, or the wraith or spirit of each girl's husband to be would appear for a moment in the chair, much like the story that you had relayed. And in Oklahoma, they would refer to it as a phantom likeness.
Yes. So and again, this is interesting because what we're talking about is a ghost, but we're talking about a ghost of a living person.
Yeah, so in a sense, it's a bit of, literally a conjuring.
Mm-hmm. And while there's certainly no indicator that rich people didn't participate in this, I do find it particularly interesting and very gratifying that the stories that we have are from, in this case, the rural people, the mountain people. These are people that by de facto likely did not have a lot of wealth in this, and then transitioning over to the Dennis O'Donohoe article, The Irish Peasants' Halloween, that was originally published in 1834, that accounts essentially a peasantry Halloween with many of the things that we would of course associate with Halloween, but then also referring back to the Molly Capes poem, things like fairies and hobgoblins and that sort of thing is also included. There is something that I would posit, that for many generations, Halloween is an everyman's holiday.
Mm-hmm.
And I really, before doing the research for tonight's episode, I really hadn't thought that much about it. But even in terms of even pop culture imagery, Halloween is very accessible. The only pop culture fiction that really comes to mind to decry that is wealthy vampire lore. The idea that your rich vampires living in their mansion, that sort of thing. Ooh, isn't it spooky? But so many of even in pop culture horror, etc., the characters, the individuals involved are not necessarily individuals of great means, but coming back to the traditions, these traditions that were largely built upon by Irish immigration into the United States. These are traditions that are certainly they're urban traditions too, but they're traditions that work just as well in rural America. They are traditions that are not limiting in their means. It's not something that only the rich people do. And
Right.
you see in comparison a lot of traditional, for example, in the British Isles or in urban regions, you see Christmas being to again paint with a very broad brush, a rich person's holiday, because after Christmas you have Boxing Day, in which all the things that you didn't want you graciously give to the poor,
Right.
who were not able to celebrate Christmas. But you really don't see that class dichotomy with Halloween. And something else that I find interesting, and I think it's again informed by the Celtic individuality, and we see it with the mask making and the aspects of revelry. It is by de facto extremely individualistic, and it is uncontainable by authoritarianism. In the case of the British Isles of these earlier eras, uncontainable by the church.
Yes. Well, and just stepping out of the constriction of society on the other 364 days a year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
it's a very cathartic process, I think, particularly for those with little means. It served a very real purpose of, for one night, they had as much power as anyone else, and perhaps more so with the trick aspect of trick or treat, that they didn't enjoy normally. From a psychological standpoint, it releases a lot of societal tension that otherwise could be exerted in other ways and more destructive ways for society.
It does. And as I noted very early on in the episode, the Halloween is a Celtic fire holiday. Although holiday is an appropriate word because it's not done during the day, it's done during the night. But regardless of that, it is undeniably Celtic. That said, we do have other European influences, the most comparatively recent being Puritanism, which of course took a very dim view of Halloween. Can't imagine why. And the Vatican, under a series of popes that really attempted to use Halloween as an opportunity to function in a mission outreach sort of way, and conflate Samhain with All Saints Day and All Saints Eve, which is very sweet and very, very noble in concept, but it is also, to me, don't hate me, no hate, no please, no, I don't care, it is a bit silly in the fact that there's, that every other day of the year was given to a saint, and they still had so many martyrs and saints left over that they finally just said, let's just, big fire sale, pun intended, and let's just put everybody on All Saints Day, which is originally November 1st, and then an attempt to then, because the Celts just appropriated it and turned it back into Samhain, then they moved it to November 2nd with the idea that would do the trick, and it didn't. And then, of course, the evening before, so just the idea that you have Christmas Day, And then you have Christmas Eve, then you had All Saints Day, and then you had All Saints Eve, and then All Saints Eve was called All Hallows Eve or All Hallowed Eve, and then that got shortened to Halloween.
Typical Celt fashion. But the funny thing is, a lot of things that people do and still do at Halloween actually has a divination aspect to it that most people don't think about, even as common as bobbing for apples.
Oh, very much so. And the utilization of apple for divination is huge. And coming back to a point that I was going to make and then I'd forgotten, but now I remembered, is the fact that there are other European influences that have impacted our understanding of Halloween. There is a very real possibility, not proven possibility, but it is a possibility that the apple aspect does actually have a Roman, a pre-Christian Latin date, predominantly with the Roman goddess Pomona, and the idea that Pomona, represented by apples, is the goddess that you perform rites to get her to tell you who your husband is going to be, etc. And the fact that this has carried on, that is not to say that the Celts may have had their own divination processes with fruit, and specifically apples, separately from Pomona and the influence of Rome. However, 2,000 years ago, Rome was exerting an extraordinary religious, cultural, and military influence on the British Celts. So it is certainly not impossible that cross-pollination of religious ideas could have taken place.
Very true. And then just, straightforwardly, apples and apple seeds were used to make prophecies. In
a wide variety of ways. And while it is an apples, it does remind me of splitting open persimmon seeds to see what the winter is going to be.
I think very much so, because apple seeds, would be used to prophesize how many children you're going to have, or how many years until someone would be married, or how many visitors you would have, those kinds of things. And then another that may surprise a few people is burning nuts over an open fire.
Yes. Because
we now associate chestnuts roasting over an open fire with Christmas.
We do in a variety of, particularly Southern European holiday traditions. And chestnuts really, especially after the chestnut blight that wiped out the American chestnut, we really don't associate chestnuts with much of anything in the United States. We know them from culture, but we don't really know them firsthand.
Sure.
And there is a movement to replant blight-resistant chestnuts in North America, and I wholeheartedly support that. Having had chestnuts, they're amazing. But I also thought it was interesting in terms of the bobbing for apples, that the flavor of the apple could also be a divination of the year ahead. So if you ended up with a sweet apple, it would be a sweet year ahead. But if you had a sour one, look out.
Yeah,
that
I like that one.
And I grew up with we didn't use it as divination specifically, but I grew up with the challenge of, can you peel an apple in one piece?
Same. Same.
And then this note from the article by Lewis and Selma Freyberg from about 1950, that apple pairings could have the virtue of prophecy. If a girl tosses an apple pairing over her shoulder to the floor, it will form into the initial of the one who loves her.
Yes.
And of course, a couple of things, salt magic, salt over the shoulder, the dumb supper, don't look over your shoulder, everything's backward. There's, and all of these things are largely speaking to essentially an attempt to manipulate divination in regards to threshold space or the veil.
Very much so. And another that's mentioned in the same article is the mirror test. It works the same way. A girl walks backwards down a cellar with a mirror in one hand and a candle in the other, and she will see the face of her true love in the mirror. So you have that idea of over the shoulder almost twice there, because she's walking backwards and looking into a mirror. And so that very much is the same idea of over the shoulder.
It is. And that, to me, it is an attempt to ritualistically function on that crossroads axis.
True.
Which does have ties to traditional hoodoo as a folk practice. And the Irish, I found this actually a little chilling. Again, from the aforementioned article, in ancient Ireland, a new fire was kindled every year on Halloween, which is known as the Eve of Samhain, the end of summer. And from this sacred flame, all the fires in Ireland were rekindled. This indicates that November 1st was the first day of the new year. The fire, which was symbolic of the sun, stood for his return after his winter disappearance and was at the same time a charm to ensure that return. So we're seeing a direct connection, sacred fire with the sun. And at a later period, it is recorded that at bedtime in some Irish houses, the ashes were raked smooth on the hearth and examined the next morning for footprints. If none appeared, all was well. If there's a footprint turned from the door and toward the interior of the house, guests or a marriage was in store. However, if it was turned toward the door, it meant a death in the coming year.
And I didn't grow up with that specific one, but my grandmother talked about if there were footprints in the ashes from the hearth, it was bad luck.
Yeah. Also,
growing up, I just took it from my grandmother because she was so fastidious of a housekeeper that it just meant that he hadn't swept the ashes up, so that was bad luck. But I'm sure it comes more from this.
during the 18th century in the Highlands and in Perthshire, torches of heath, broom, flax, or ferns were carried about the fields and villages by each family to ensure good crops. The celebrants went about the fields from east to west, the direction of the sun. Afterward, all the torches were thrown in a heap and a bonfire made of them. Each person put in one stone over which ashes were then raked. In the morning, each looked for his pebble, and if it was found to be displaced or harmed, or if a footprint was marked in the ashes nearby, it foreboded death within a year.
Interesting.
We also begin to see in this process what appears to be a transition from sacrifice and an ancient tradition of human sacrifice
Mhm.
to an animal sacrifice, to the sacrifice of a thing, to the use of the symbolism, because in relationship to the church, because in time, so for example, there's some pretty reasonable evidence that human sacrifice then transitioned to the sacrifice of a bull or sacrifice of cattle in fire.
Mhm.
And that does seem to be consistent. The fire sacrifice seems to be consistent across the board. But even now, a great deal of time ago, over 1,000 years ago, would have the references to not a sacrifice, but the fire and smoke of twin bonfires being used as a protector. And the cattle herds would be run between the bonfires.
Mhm.
And it was essentially a protection against the fairies.
Exactly. Um, because it's a little analogous to fairy grow, the idea of it's bad luck to build a house between two fairy groves, where they're in a line, because the fairies travel that route.
Yes, and if you're going to do something that ridiculous, at least make a way for them to troop through without having to divert their path. Also, I took particular note of this. In Derbyshire, torches of straw were carried about the haystacks on All Souls' Eve to light souls through purgatory. And so we begin to see
no, go ahead.
we begin to see that transition where the symbolism is very powerful, but we begin to see other belief systems being incorporated into it.
Yes, and in the Highlands, it got to a point where boys would go house to house asking for fuel for fire to burn witches.
Can't be too careful. The continuation of that, of course, is going to draw a direct line to a jack-o'-lantern.
Yes.
Because the gist of the tradition of Jack of the Lantern is that he was a blacksmith who was too evil for heaven, but had outwit Satan, and was thus cast out of hell, left to wander. And the implied place of wandering is that liminal space between worlds.
Yes. Which and makes him even more of a foreboding character.
And it is. I mean, and it, it really speaks to this idea of this wandering mercenary soul in the between worlds, and Halloween is the time when he can pass through back into our world.
Yes. And to be honest, in some ways, it calls up, images of, the son, the devil went down to Georgia, and besting the devil, but Jack is actually a much darker character because he's banished from heaven, and we don't think about that aspect of it when we're carving pumpkins.
No, we don't. And the original candle, the ember that went into the lantern, was a glowing ember from the fires of hell.
Yes. Oops, we don't mention that in front of the children.
Think about that when you're pulling the pumpkin guts out. Of course, it wasn't a pumpkin; it was a turnip.
It was a turnip. Yes. Much harder to carve, by the way.
It's very vastly harder to carve. Oh, that it our Halloween tradition never included growing up, never included trick or treating because we lived on 30 acres and it was a blacktop that you would be taking your life in your hands if you were to walk up and down. And my parents were not about to take us to town for something like that. So, and I don't say that bitterly. We
Yeah.
had wonderful Halloween traditions. Interestingly enough, for a long time, we had bonfires, which again, the traditional bonfire is directly harkening back to the Celts. But we would carve a pumpkin, often, not always, but often pumpkins that we grew, and would carve a very simple pumpkin, put a candle in it, and then put it on an old elm stump that was on the other side of the garden. Turn off all of the lights in the house, and then stand and admire the jack-o'-lantern out in the yard. There were no other houses around. There was nothing else. And I remember one particular Halloween, it was very gloomy, rainy, misting rain. And that jack-o'-lantern out there was seriously the eeriest thing that me as a 5 or 6 year old could ever have seen. And I loved it.
Well, I mean, just the visual image of that, is eerie to think about and would be a great opening to a horror movie.
Oh, and it is. I mean, it's I do at this point largely attribute my love and enduring obsession with Halloween to be certainly fueled by my Celtic ancestry.
I think the same for me, to be honest. But there's an aspect in modern traditions of Halloween that serve the same purpose as they really did for the ancient Celts, and it is that catharsis, and it's that communal release of tension and a mandate and approval to do what you aren't supposed to do any other time.
It is.
And I think that, in some ways, that can serve a real psychological purpose. Now, granted, as you alluded to earlier, it can get out of hand. It could get out of hand when you're having to haul your outhouse off the roof. But at least the feigned delinquency that is perpetrated today is a little less imbued with fecal matter,
Which is positive.
It is
Very positive. From page 298 of our notes, the bond at the very base, the bonfire itself as a symbol underwent changes in different times and places. When the influence of the church made itself felt, some people abandoned bonfires altogether at Halloween and used only candles. Others did not use fire in any form as an integral part of the celebration. In America, the bonfire has been revived by the children who burn in it all sorts of objects which they have appropriated without the permission of their parents. The children do not, of course, recognize the sacrificial aspect of this highly pleasurable custom. If they think of it at all, they probably regard the fire as a defiant act directed against authority in general and their parents in particular.
Definitely. And personally, I view s'mores as a sacrifice.
Oh, I'm a marshmallow purist. I frustrate all those around me by insisting that my marshmallows be cooked a very specific way, as is appropriate to my nature. But this article from the 1950s assumes that the children just steal things and throw them into a bonfire. And this is the first time, I may just be late to the party on this aspect, but this is the first time that I've heard of this tradition.
I mean, I've read about it, but I've never known anyone who did that, known any instances or even, family stories of that ever happening. But I've read a time or two where that would happen, but I think now we just view it as, out of control toddler.
Yes. I also love this. This is from page 300. In the Isle of Man, the people see circles of light in the late October midnight, and the fairies dancing within them. In Ireland, the doors to their secret dwellings underground are open only on Halloween, and the human who enters at that time may be kept there for 7 years or forever.
Mm-hmm.
Powerfully, it was an early belief, and one repeated by Burns, that the fairies held a grand anniversary that night. This in time became related to the witches' Sabbath. And
interesting the conflation with fairies and witches together.
Yes, I mean our modern sensibilities, of course, first of all, do not do fairies justice.
No,
we have a number of grand pop culture films to thank for that, which will remain nameless, but we all know what they are. And with that, we associate fairies, fairies with very delicate, magical femininity is how we largely associate modern day fairies.
Yeah.
And the fairies, or more appropriately,
almost exclusively.
The fae of old were anything but delicate, and they were typically terrifying and very capricious. And the reference, and this seems to be perhaps a little bit more of a continental European influence, but the concept of the light elves and the dark elves, but that to a degree references or has some similarity with the Seelie and the unseelie courts of the Irish fairy. And the idea that all fae are dangerous, all fae are to be regarded with the utmost of respect. You tread lightly when you are in the presence or believed to be in the presence of the fae. You respect them immensely. You give them whatever they want, and you hope for the best. But the Seelie court, essentially the High Court, often would manifest themselves in forms that we might more closely associate with Tolkien's elven races, Galadriel and Elrond and Thranduil, that type of imagery, these powerful superhuman beings associated with light. The church would later land on the idea that they were ambiguous fallen angels, that they had, or that they were angels that in the war in heaven they refused to pick sides, and so the devil wouldn't take them and God threw them out, and they landed splat in Ireland.
Jack.
Yes. But then when you really want to get to some Halloween fun, that's when you get to the Unseelie court, the dark elves. I think my favorite of the dark elves is the Dullahan, or the dark fae. And the dark fae probably does more to inform our headless horseman concept than anything else. He's not a horseman; he's a coachman, the Coach de Var, and the Dullahan collects those who are fated to die.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
basically another version of the Grim Reaper.
Yes, a Grim Reaper, a ferryman, and there's a wonderful ambiguity, you could say duality, in this, and that the Dullahan, like the Banshee, is not a bringer of death. They are the messengers, almost almost interestingly enough. I mean, the word angel means messenger. They're the ones with the news, but instead of the news of the Christ child, it is the news that you're going to die.
Exactly. And I think, and that's really a misnomer about the Grim Reaper and the Ferryman as well, is that they technically aren't killing people, they are escorting them.
Yes, announcing, escorting. The the lore associated with the Banshee, I think, is one of the most misunderstood. We call the Banshee, we understand the Banshee as a wailing, in many cases, particularly in pop culture, a wailing ghost, whose cry kills, and that is absolutely not the case. The Banshees are a fae manifestation, a fae race. Race is not really the right word because they're non-corporeal, but a fae manifestation specifically associated with the lineage of certain Irish families. And they are the wailing fae. They are crying a lament, as in their space and place within the veil, they can see the death before we can, before mortals are able to sense it. And so hearing their cries is a lament. These are fae who are spiritually and emotionally invested and attached to specific families. They are crying, knowing of the heartbreak that is coming to the family.
And in the Scottish version of the Banshee, they are connected to the family, and are almost ancestral, not technically fae, but not technically ancestral either, and but serve the exact same function.
And it's seeing this larger cosmology begin to open up really helps change the perspective on things that we would otherwise be regarding as simply horrifying or simply terrifying, or, oh my goodness, it's here to kill us. And that's not the case. That's not how these things are necessarily understood. That is not to say that there are not dark fae and other forces that are there to kill you, but the Banshee are not one of them.
Right. They're not, they're not all alike. And that's, I think that is something that we tend to make things very one-dimensional through pop culture, and misnomers come about. I think one of the really interesting takeaways from all of this is that in this traditional lore with the thinning of the threshold space, that we go from the ancient Celtic view that the dead and ghosts stay in our realm, and they go about their business. They pursue their occupations and go about their homes and so forth as they did in life. And then over time that's changed, and but I was thinking about this today going through the materials. That version of it is actually more akin to what we find in paranormal investigation and research.
It is, and that reference what actually really struck a chord with me in terms of a much older cosmology, making more sense with a lived experience than what our quite frankly, what our secularism or our theology tells us.
I agree. And because that is the conclusion that I come to so many times in research, is that who we're communicating with, and whether you want to explain it as a lingering ghost or a time function of time and space, communicating in 2 points in time, you're dealing with someone that is going about their life as they lived it in whatever time period.
Yes. And that's and to me what that says, first of all, is that the more our more ancient, our ancestors were dealing with and interacting with this type of phenomena, and typically we're doing it in a fairly everyday sort of way, and they're more I would posit more organic cosmology
Mm-hmm.
incorporated these beliefs so that it wasn't so alien.
No, it really was a part of normal life. And as such, that familiarity, I won't say necessarily resulted in not being afraid, because they definitely, their traditions definitely show that they were very wary of the dead, but that to accept that it is a normal part of our existence.
And that, I think, is a powerful motif in the reality that there are points to be wary. There are points to walk with trepidation and to be respectful and to not be rude, to be properly mannered in how we interact with the veil, how we interact with all of this, and to walk with so many of these belief structures include things that I take great solace in, the most specific one being the veneration of our ancestors.
Agreed.
And the concept that our ancestors guide us, can support us, and in some way inform us in varying ways. And I think that's unbelievably beautiful. I think there's extraordinary solace in that. And there's to me, there's two aspects that really are fighting, pushing against these ideas. They're very time honored, they're very beautiful, they're very contextually rich, and they speak very powerfully to the human experience. But the forces in opposition, one is a more box-like theology that attempts to put everything in very tidy boxes, and say that's what Scripture says. I think that a thorough reading of Scripture suggests otherwise, because in Scripture, although a very different location than the British Isles, we were dealing with individuals and cultures that dealt with very complex cosmologies and realities. And we see this from the magicians of Pharaoh to various occurrences in transitioning into the promised land. We see this with the appearance of the Magi, and their essentially use of the signs of the stars to herald the coming Christ. So there's and these things, interestingly enough, particularly the nativity traditions, inform a sense of wonder and magic that has fortunately been included in the Christmas season. But then we say, no, it's just relegated to those moments. It's not an everyday thing, or it's not something that
Yeah.
that happens with normal people. And I think that's unfair. But the box like, or the everything needs to go into a neat cubicle box with our theology is actually very secular. I mean, it's really pushed in a sense of the idea, and I suspect, I don't officially know this, but I suspect a fairly strong philosophical movement in an attempt to move the church away from quote unquote superstition and modernize it. And by modernizing it, introducing a strong sense of really mid-century, secularism or modernism. And these are things that say your ancestors don't matter, but the mall at the edge of town does. Your new gods are on TV. Your new the wisdom of the ages is going to be found if you tune in at 5 p.m. Or 4 p.m. and watch a talk show instead of listening to your grandparents or your great grandparents or learning from their stories. It's very dichotomy. It is very, very much a cultural contrast.
It is, and certainly, I mean, encapsulated in pretty stark terms in Neil Gaiman's American Gods. I mean,
yes.
Very much so.
Love the fact that he was in Cairo, and also Rock City. I've seen those dioramas at Rock City. For anybody who's read American God, those dioramas are real. They're amazing.
Well, and then as far as connections to those arts, there's a scene in Humansville, Missouri, with a leprechaun, and an unstated description of the Bloody Benders.
Yes.
So that, if you don't know what he's talking about, you only know what he's talking about if you know what he's talking about.
And I think based on the lateness of the hour and the amount of material that we have yet to get through,
I agree.
I do think that Halloween is appropriately going to be a multi-part episode. That said, perhaps for me, the most important thing about Halloween, and this for some, particularly for some of my fellow Christians, conservative Christians at that, because I am a conservative Christian in many ways, would find this strange for me to say, but to me, Halloween's most important impact on our society is it is one night or one season that encourages and introduces us to step into this realm of a much less secular world, and one that begins to contemplate these larger realities, these larger cosmologies, these difficult questions, and I think we are much richer because of it.
I agree, and that certainly does lead into part 2 of this discussion, as well as how pop culture has affected it. And on that note, don't forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to State of the Ozarks online magazine, Always Buying Books, and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping to bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
On the next episode, we are going to be discussing more Halloween lore and how pop culture has affected how we celebrate the season. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or about any other podcast platform. Thank you, everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.